All right, was Ade Oladipo wrong about George Foreman? His comments have caused a massive debate amongst boxing fans. So in this video, we're going to listen to what Ade said and then we're going to break it down. But before we do that, I have to say shout out to Ade, shout out to G-Man and shout out to Emily Eubank because they're doing some really good stuff on the BBC. Their podcast is really good. They talk about some really, really good stuff over there. But look, let's have a listen to what Ade said. The conversation was about marketability of fighters and George Foreman's name came up. And let's see what was said and then we can talk about it further. Have a listen to this.
I am going to name someone who we've already mentioned before and he's already on this list on the Frankenstein, Mr. George Foreman. George Foreman. No.
That's horrendous.
How?
That's horrendous.
Did you ever have a George Foreman grill?
No.
Did you? Yes.
I don't recall. But I don't think that's got anything to do with marketability in terms of the fight.
Yeah. What, because he can sell grills, all of a sudden he can fight?
One of the biggest fights of all time, Rumble in the Jungle, Kinshasa Zaire, Muhammad Ali, George Foreman.
No, it's not in the top. It's not in the top 10.
Excuse me.
It's not in the top 10 of money making pay-per-views.
Had it been today's market, it would have been.
Yeah, that's because of a certain guy called Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali could have fought Joe Frazier there. He could have fought anyone. It's Muhammad Ali. Ali, Boumaye. I never heard anything about Foreman.
Yeah.
That is all Muhammad Ali.
You can have it. It's fine.
I will take George Foreman.
Let's hope you're
and my George Foreman grill.
So
that's when he was a pastor, right? He bought out the Foreman grill.
No, he was. I think he became heavyweight champion.
Yeah.
Beat oldest heavyweight champion in history, mind you.
Yeah.
And they all wanted to fight George Foreman.
Yeah.
And then they wanted to give it to Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan said no. George Foreman said, I'll take it. And he made more money from the grills than he did in boxing.
Look, it's an interesting conversation because I feel like when you talk about George Foreman, you have to talk about George Foreman in two separate ways. You have to talk about the George Foreman before the Ali fight and the George Foreman after the Ali fight. Now, Ade Oladipo is not totally wrong. He's not wrong about his comments about George Foreman because I think Ade is looking at the George Foreman during the Ali fight, the George Foreman that we all saw during the Ali fight. And I think G-Man have taken the George Foreman that we saw during the Ali fight and then the George Foreman that came back after going outside of boxing, doing a whole bunch of other things and then coming into boxing. So I think Ade and G-Man are looking at things from a different perspective. I don't think either of them are wrong per se. But look, the conversation is really interesting because George Foreman, is he marketable or is he not? And as I said, with George Foreman, you have to talk about him in two separate ways, right? The George Foreman that fought Muhammad Ali, that George Foreman, the truth is, he wasn't marketable because there wasn't a lot of businesses that were waiting to put their name, behind George Foreman and give him a push. Yes, he was a world champion. Yes, he was knocking people out. Yes, he was devastating. Yes, he was dominating the division because George Foreman came into the division as someone, that was very fearsome. And a lot of people did not want to get in the ring with him. So George Foreman had that reputation of a fearsome puncher. But George Foreman did not have the backing of the media because George Foreman was a very quiet guy. He didn't say a lot. He wasn't very, media friendly. He wasn't sort of a darling of the US media. He wasn't that. Muhammad Ali was that guy. Muhammad Ali was that person who was very charismatic. He can talk, he can make jokes. And, Muhammad Ali, although he had his political situation going on, he still had some people that supported what he was doing. George Foreman, on the other hand, was all the way just behind the cameras and wasn't saying much. And so during the Ali fight, yes, in Zaire, Congo, Muhammad Ali was a famous guy and everybody was talking about Ali Boumaye because Ali was the guy. However, George Foreman, came back from the Ali fight and that was a totally different George Foreman that we saw because this fight really broke George Foreman. And I watched George Foreman's documentary where they talk about how George Foreman was a different fighter after this. After the Ali fight, George Foreman was never the same because the truth is that nobody expected Muhammad Ali to beat George Foreman. George Foreman was the fearsome guy. Everybody feared him. Nobody wanted to get into the ring with him. Muhammad Ali wanted to do it because he's Ali and he's got confidence, right? But George Foreman was in his prime and everybody was picking George Foreman to destroy Muhammad Ali because George Foreman had absolutely obliterated Joe Frazier a few fights before or a fight before fighting Muhammad Ali. So George Foreman was coming in his prime. So people did not expect George Foreman to lose against Ali. And by the way, George Foreman also did not expect to lose to Muhammad Ali. So after the loss, George Foreman took it really hard. And this is during the time that George Foreman found Jesus Christ. He became a pastor, he became a preacher, started preaching to, the community, started a church. And as I said, when you watch his documentary and the movie that they made about him, you can learn a little bit more about George Foreman and what he became after the Muhammad Ali fight. And then, of course, after getting into ministry and after becoming a Christian and preaching the word of Jesus Christ, George Foreman returned to boxing. Now, that George Foreman was totally different, because all of a sudden, George Foreman was very nice. He was very magnanimous. He was saying good things about Muhammad Ali. It felt like George Foreman was friends with Muhammad Ali, and he was really a likable guy. And of course, he went on to beat Michael Moorer to become the oldest heavyweight champion of the world. And then he got the George Foreman grill deal and went on to make more money with the grill than he did in boxing. So George Foreman, in the earlier stage of his career, before the Muhammad Ali fight, was not very marketable. The George Foreman after the Muhammad Ali fight was very, very marketable, because that George Foreman grill did a lot. Like, people in the US loved that George Foreman grill. I'm sure that people in the UK also participated in buying that George Foreman grill, but that's because George Foreman was behind the whole thing, right? George Foreman was behind the marketing. George Foreman was the image for the grill. And because he's a champion, because of his name in boxing, people gravitated to the product and people bought the product. So was George Foreman marketable? Absolutely. After he came back from the Ali loss, after he was rejuvenated, after he had found himself and he came back again, that George Foreman was very marketable. And one particular point the G-Man made that I thought was very true was the fact that if Foreman versus Ali was in today's age, was in 2026, it would have been a much bigger fight. I agree 100%, because that fight was a massive fight, not just in Africa, but all over the world, because at that time, boxing was a global sport. Like, people spent their time and their money following boxing during that time, because Muhammad Ali transcended the sport of boxing and brought a lot of eyeballs into boxing. So Muhammad Ali versus George Foreman, if it was today, if it was in this day and age, in 2026, it would have made a lot more pay-per-view. It would have crossed over to the casual boxing fans in so many ways and so many dimensions that you would not believe. So that fight was a big fight. Until this day, we keep talking about how that fight was a great fight and how big that fight was. So you can imagine how big that fight will be in this day and age. So look, in all, I don't think that Ade was wrong in saying that, is it the same George Foreman that sold the grill? Because as I said, George Foreman, when you look at his career before the Ali fight, you wouldn't think that he was marketable. But after the Ali fight, he was marketable. And George Foreman versus Muhammad Ali was a big fight. And in this day and age, would have been even much bigger fight than we saw back in the days. But guys, get in the comment section. Let me know what you think about this conversation that is going on around in boxing right now, where Ade made those comments about George Foreman. What do you think about it? Get in the comment section and let me know your thoughts.